Hello, my name's Jo Ryan, a subject specialist from BPP, and I'm here today to give you some guidance on how to deal with variances in your F5 examination. The syllabus areas that we'll be focusing on are D2, 3, 4 and 5. To give you an overview then, we'll be looking at the style of the questions and how best to approach them during your exam. The F5 exam builds on knowledge then that you will have gained from your FMA examination. But what we have to realise then is what the examiner's looking for here is very different in terms of style and technique. The time of rote learning has passed and we're looking here for some application towards how the business is performing, thinking about the fact that we're appraising the company's performance and thinking about how it's being managed. The additional syllabus areas that you'll need to be aware of for variances are to do with material mix and yield variances, thinking about sales mix and quantity variances, also thinking about breaking it down into planning and operational variances, as well as being asked to prepare full operating statements under either marginal costing or absorption costing. So previously then you may be used to just calculating one variance for 2 marks. Here you could be asked to pull together the whole operating statement, and you'll need to have remembered the pro forma and think about the approach and the layout as well as the content of your answer. Something else which is very critical at F5 is the interdependence of variances, so thinking about discursive elements as well as actually being able to perform the calculations. Undertaking a review then of 5 exams that were sat from June 2009 to June 2011, all 5 of those contained a 20-mark question on variances, so it's an absolutely critical topic area for students about to embark on this paper. You need to be prepared for discursive elements as well as the calculations. In these papers then 25% to 40% of the marks awarded were for discussion, so it's not enough to just be prepared for the calculations, and I cannot emphasise enough how important it is to practice the discussion parts of questions as part of your revision phase as well as those calculations. So we need to be prepared to think about why things are important. We need to be able to discuss the performance, we need to be able to look at the standards that are being used and possibly to critique what exists in the scenario. So if we're thinking then about how the business has performed in our performance management paper and we can use variances to help us, we might want to think about using a real question. So I'm going to talk you through crumbly cakes, a question which occurred in the June 2009 examination. The examiner here has said that the calculations were well undertaken, but students struggled with part A. Here then we've got the information from the scenario, and I've highlighted out some of the key points which I'm going to talk you through now, and think about the processes that should have been going through your mind as you were preparing for this question. This is something that could have been undertaken during the reading time of the exam, so you could have got your thoughts well organised before the exam actually started to give you a head start over some of the other students. So first of all then, I like to know what it is that the company is about so that I can get the idea and get in the mindset of the company straight away. So crumbly cakes then here are making cakes sold direct to the public. We're told then that the production manager is looking at using organic ingredients in the cake production, and we're not expected to know they're more expensive. We're given that information, and we're told then that these organic ingredients lead to improved flavour and health benefits to the customer. All of this is the background information, and it's important to bear this in mind as we're reading through the rest of the scenario. So here then, and this is very important, it's a responsibility-based standard costing system, and the managers only get a bonus when favourable net variances are allocated to them. We're given information then about the fact that this change starts in March in production, but we don't make any changes to the standard costs. So the variances then which have been calculated for us are based on the old costs, which include the non-organic ingredients. We're given the information then and the actual variances. I've put a yellow box around those because I wouldn't actually get too bogged down in the detail of these until I was ready to start writing my answer. Obviously I'm reading this out loud and I've slowed it down, but during the exam you need to be reading and digesting the information quickly. The production manager then is upset that he's lost all hope of a bonus under the system, and yet the sales manager thinks that it's excellent. And we're also told they have no inventory. So if we have a look then at the detailed requirement, we're being asked to assess the performance of the production manager and the sales manager and indicate whether the current bonus scheme is fair to those concerned. So what we've got here then is two things that we need to do. Assess the performance of both the production manager and the sales manager, but we also need to make some kind of comment on whether the bonus system is fair. And I think it's a good idea to get it very clear in our heads before we start writing what it is that we want to do. What we need to think about then when we're actually answering this question then in terms of ideas is that we've got 7 marks available here, so it's an indication we need to be coming up with about 7 well explained points. We need to recognise then that the move towards organic ingredients is a fundamental change in the business and the nature of the company. Before then, and it's important to look at the before as well as the after, the production manager had, albeit very small, but favourable variances, and so therefore would have been getting a bonus. The move then towards the organic ingredients was his idea, and yet it's going to leave him with overall adverse variances. Material price then is adverse because, as we're told, the organic ingredients are more expensive. The mix then is also adverse, and although we've got a very slightly favourable yield, so we're getting a little bit more out of the process, it's not enough to compensate for those very high additional costs for the organic ingredients. So the organic food then is leading to adverse variances for the production manager. However, if we think about the business as a whole, sales have gone up as represented by the very favourable variances that the sales manager is experiencing. So in February there were adverse sales variances for him and no bonus, whereas in March these variances are favourable in terms of the number sold and also the price of those. What we see then is that the sales manager has been involved in actually pushing these organic things, and so will have had to be involved in the selling process, and so can take some of the claim for responsibility, but it was the production manager's idea, and therefore he should take some of the credit too. What we see here then is that the company needs to change some of the standards and also needs to think about changing the bonus system to make it fairer. Having looked at that question then, we can see that the discussion elements are really important and need to be properly planned before we start writing, so that you're clear in your head of what the structure of your answer is going to be and also the content of it. I've pulled some of the key points out to remember here, and something that the examiner is very keen on is that adverse variances are not always bad, and conversely, favourable variances aren't always good news. So in the overall case of crumbly cakes, the choosing to use the organic ingredients was a good idea. However, it led to an adverse material price variance, which we might initially think is bad news, but when we looked at it in the overall context, we saw that for the company overall, it was the right decision in terms of sales volumes and sales revenues. That brings me on to my next point then. Variances shouldn't be viewed in isolation. We need to think about all of the variances and what the overall picture is that they show. In addition to that, you might need to look at trends over time in different questions, and you might also need to be thinking about when it would be appropriate to investigate and when it wouldn't be. The other thing to remember then is that performance management systems are not perfect. So just because a company has a system in place doesn't necessarily mean that it is the best way to appraise their staff and to allocate rewards. So thinking about motivation and thinking about the importance that it has on behavioural implications for employees is also very important. Also, you need to think about the appropriateness of the standards used. in the case of the last question, using the standards for non-organic ingredients when we're making organic cakes clearly made the appraisal system much less useful because we're not using like with like to make our comparisons. So how should we approach our questions then? Well, we've seen that we need to establish the context and get the ideas buzzing around in our head about what the company does, and we also need to underline our key verbs and key requirements to make sure that we're clear what requirements there are within a sub-requirement. We also need to allocate our time not just to the individual questions but to the subparts of the questions. We can use then 1.8 minutes per mark as a guide for how long we need to spend thinking about it and planning it as well as writing it, but also as a guide for the volume of work required. If something is going to take you 30 minutes, the examiner's not going to give you 2 marks for it. So if you're approaching a 2-mark requirement and it's spending ages on it, then you need to be moving on and you've perhaps got the wrong idea. Also, decide on the order, play to your strengths first. You don't have to do part A first, you can do part B. When you review Crumbly Cakes, which I suggest you do, you'll see that part B then was asking you to calculate some variances, and you may have felt more comfortable doing the calculations first, and as long as you make sure that you leave yourself sufficient time to approach part A afterwards, then you could have done it in that way. Also, make sure that your answer refers back to the scenario. So in this case, thinking about cakes, thinking about using words like eating. If we're looking at a hospital, for example, we wouldn't talk about customers, we would talk about patients. Just little things that you can put into your answer to give them style and to impress the marker. What we should ask ourselves then is, if I was in the manager's shoes, would these comments make sense to me? So do they relate back to the scenario enough? It's not sufficient to just learn things from a textbook at this level. You need to be making sure that you apply them. The next thing I want to think about is why you're calculating these variances. What's the purpose of them? What is it that you're trying to achieve? And I'm going to use a question from June 2010's exam to help with this sticky wicket. So here then we've got part B, and this time we're going to look at how to approach the calculation side of the question. So I've underlined the requirement here: calculate the material, labour and sales variances for May 2000 and X0 in as much detail as the information allows. Phrases like "as much detail as the information allows" throw people because they don't like not being told what it exactly is that the examiner wants. So how could you have known what to do? Well, in this case, you could think about the type of company. This company makes cricket bats, and you could think about what it is that you want a material variance for. Well, you want to know whether you paid more for your materials or whether you use them efficiently. So thinking about what it is that they're showing would also help. Another tip then, which would have helped in this question, is by using the rest of the question, and this part came first before requirement A. We've given a variance report then for the month of April, and we're given there a list of 5 variances. So we could use those then as a starting point for our answer to part B, so giving you some structure for your answer to part B to work out which variances you could calculate. And rather than being asked to calculate total variances, it was as much information, so we need to break those down into price and usage for materials. In labour then, the biggest hint that we needed to calculate the idle time variance was the fact that we had one in April and we're given information about idle time in the scenario. When it came to calculating our sales variances then, a question I'm often asked is, how do you know whether to calculate your sales volume variance under absorption costing or marginal costing? And again, here the answer is in the scenario. So it uses a standard costing system based on marginal costs, so you would need to use marginal costing. Once you decided what you wanted to do, calculating the variances then would have been quite straightforward, and hopefully would have generated you a good number of marks if you're well prepared. In previous examiners' reports then, they have commented that it's naive of students to go into the exam not knowing the basic variances, because if these are tested, they're a good opportunity for the well-prepared candidate to score well. It might be that you don't get the basic variances, though you might have to calculate some of those mix and yield variances like you did in crumbly cakes. If that's the case, you need to make sure that you're happy with the techniques required to do so. If you would like some more practice, some good questions to try then from past papers are listed here for you. So from December 2010 then, there was a question carried which was looking at planning and operational variances. This is one where you were given the answers, the totals, and you had to break them down. This can be a blessing, but it can also be a distraction. If you don't get it to reconcile back to the answers that you've got, but you think you've made your best stab at the technique and you've run out of time, move on. There's no point in chasing marks that you don't know how to get when you've got other parts of the paper unattempted. Question 2 from June 2010 was Sticky Wicket, which we've already looked at a little bit. It had those basic variances for 13 marks, but there were also 7 marks available for discussion of performance, which you may like to look at. From December 2009, there was SecureNet, which was looking at planning and operational variances as well as the usual discussion. And then question 3 that we've seen part A of the discussion, but there are also some mix and yield variances there for you to calculate. If you want to know more, there are some articles that you might find useful to read in the archives of the Student Accountant magazine available from the ACCA website from April 2011. There's an article on materials mix and yield variances, information about calculating those variances. There's also an article written by the old examiner Jeff Caldwell about measuring planning variances, and it outlines the approach that he recommends to dealing with planning and operational variances. Finally then, there's an article about how to approach and impress the examiner when faced with variance questions in the exam that you may also find useful. I hope that you found this presentation useful, and I would recommend that you do lots of question practice on this key area, and would like to wish you good luck in your examination.